Yesterday, on Sunday the 30th of October 2022, my friend Liz and I visited the British Library to see their exhibition on Alexander the Great, the making of a myth. Here's the catalogue. The exhibition is not about Alexander's life, but really his afterlife, how his story, his legend, was disseminated across the world in the years, the centuries, the millennia after his death up to the present. So there were exhibits of scrolls, books, art, paintings, even a fan along the way, armour which had details of his story on it, references to Oliver Stone's film, which came out 20 or so years ago, nearly now. Anyway, it's a really good exhibition. And before we went in, for Liz, we recorded just me speaking to her phone, giving a quick background of Alexander's life. Pardon me. Unfortunately, her phone didn't record the whole thing. So I thought, Liz, for you now, I'll do the same again. Hope you enjoy it. And the same goes for anyone else who happens to watch this. So, Alexander was born in 356 BC in the capital of ancient Macedonia, or Macedon, called Pella. Pella no longer exists except as a ruin or archaeological site, but it's in what is now the province of Macedonia in northern Greece. Don't think of North Macedonia, separate country. The people there, Slavic, came many years later, 1,000 years after Alexander, or just about. So he was born in Pella. His father was Philip II, the king, and his mother Olympias. The Macedonian kings were polygamous, and Olympias was Philip's third or fourth king. We're not quite sure. She was from Epirus in western Greece, and she was certainly the most prominent of Philip's wives, mainly, I think, because of Alexander. He was his most able son. Philip had two. The other son was a young man called Aridaeus. Unfortunately, he had an impediment, or something happened to him along the way, which meant that he wasn't mentally fit to be king. If he became a king, he would have been a puppet, which is what happened after Alexander died, unfortunately. Anyway, Macedonia didn't practice primogeniture, so in 336, when Philip was assassinated, as happened to Macedonian kings quite often, it wasn't automatic that Alexander would take his place. He was immediately acclaimed king, and then he used his own abilities to get rid of all rival claimants, and that secured his position. So that's how he became king. Prior to then, he was a serious candidate because he had proved himself as much as anything on the battlefield. We know he fought at least one battle when he was 16 in charge of some men, and then he fought at the more famous Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC alongside his father. Philip, as Macedonian kings did, fought on the right wing of his army against a combined army of Athens and Thebes, while Alexander fought alongside cavalry on the left wing on that occasion. After becoming king, he would go on to the right wing. The combined army of Athens and Thebes contained the famous Sacred Band, the soldiers who were lovers, who it was believed would fight more the harder because they loved one another. They had a very good reputation, so it must have been true. However, they met their match against the Macedonians and were almost wiped out to a man. And they were buried at the site of the battle. There's a lion statue that was erected afterwards, still there today, commemorating their deaths. So Alexander became king in 336 BC. He spent the next 2 years securing his northern borders by campaigning against Illyria, tribes in Illyria and Thrace. He also spent the time securing Macedon's control over southern Greece. Philip had won that control. However, after Philip died, some of the cities tried to break away. Athens thought about it, Thebes did it. Alexander went south to bring them back into line. Thebes wasn't having any of it, even after Chaeronea, and fought a very hard battle, which it lost. And as a result, Alexander razed the city to the ground, and that was it. Thebes was wiped out until his successor as king of Macedonia, Cassander, after Alexander's death, refounded the city. Anyway, in 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont to begin his campaign against the Persian Empire. Why did he do it? Well, in 150 years earlier, the Persian Empire under Darius Xerxes had invaded Greece. The famous Battle of Marathon took place at that time. They'd swept south, the Persians, and burnt Athens. And there were several famous battles, Plataea, and one or two others. I tried to remember the names of. Anyway, the Greeks famously beat the Persians back, and they never came back again. However, the scars, the trauma remained. Philip intended to invade the Persian Empire. So Alexander, on one hand, he was fighting a war of revenge for what had happened 140 and 50 years earlier. And on the other, he was following simply in his father's footsteps. Was Philip fighting, or did Philip intend to fight a war of revenge before he was assassinated? Not sure. Whatever Philip had done, though, he would definitely not, I think, have done what Alexander did, which was cross the Hellespont, invade Asia Minor, Western Asia Minor, and then carried on going east, carried on into the Levant, Egypt, and beyond. Philip more likely would have invaded, campaigned for a season, won loot, and then gone back home, perhaps done the same thing the following year. However, Alexander, he crossed over. Not long afterwards, within weeks, he fought his first major engagement against a satrapal army at the river Granicus in northwestern Asia Minor, Turkey. Satraps were the governors of the Persian Empire. So when Alexander invaded, they put an army together, a whole bunch of the satraps were in it, and they fought the Macedonians at this river and were comprehensively defeated. Many of them were killed. There were many Greek mercenaries who fought alongside the Persians. They were in the back line. They should have been in the front. They were by far the better soldiers than the Persian soldiers. The Greeks, they were the best thinkers. They were the best soldiers of their day. However, they were surrounded by the Macedonians and wiped out. Those who survived were sent off to mines, where they would remain for some time until their cities sued successfully for their release. After the Battle of Granicus, Alexander went south. He freed the Greek cities down there. Then he went further across into Asia Minor. Along the way, he found he either solved the puzzle of the Gordian knot or worked out how to untie it, or, depending on which account you read, he just slashed it with his sword. And according to the legend, whoever untied or undid the Gordian knot would become king of Asia. And so that's why Alexander was very keen to sort it out. Now, prophecy was on his side. He moved on. He almost died in south-eastern Asia Minor after jumping into a river to bathe and then coming down with chills, the river Kidnus. He came that close to dying, but fortunately recovered, despite one of his generals, Parmenion, telling him not to trust his doctor. Parmenion had told him that, or written to him and said, "The man's in the pay of the Persian great king Darius III, don't trust him." But Alexander did, and it paid off. Not long after his recovery, he fought Darius III for the first time in the Battle of Issus, the Battle of the Issus River, in northwestern, what is now northwestern Syria, or southeasternmost corner of Turkey. They fought by the sea. No time to sunbathe by the sea, though. It was a great battle, a very confined space, which suited Alexander perfectly. He had the smaller army. Darius couldn't use his larger army. Alexander won a comprehensive battle, but Darius escaped to fight another day. After the battle, rather than pursue Darius, Alexander continued south down the Levant. So he passed Sidon and then Tyre, the island town. Tyre today still exists, but it's attached to the mainland, and the reason for this is that Alexander put the city under siege. He created two moles, causeways, to reach it. As it happened, in the end, he took the city from the sea, but the moles were there, and over the years afterwards, the centuries, they silted up, and eventually they silted up so much you could create a town. You could build a town there, which is what's happened. So there's a very physical example of Alexander's presence in the past, in the present. It took him 7 months to take the city, but he did in a very bloody battle. He then carried on south to a place called Gaza, which he put under siege for another couple of months, and before taking that as well. He then went into Egypt. The Egyptians hated the Persians, so accepted Alexander as their liberator. While in Egypt, he founded the settlement of Alexandria, and it became a city later on. Did Alexander expect it to be a city, a great city, as it became, or just a military trading outpost? You can decide. After or before Alexandria was founded, depending on the account, he went into the desert to the oasis of Siwa, where he met the priests there to ask them certain secret questions. The questions were, had all his father Philip's killers been killed? And the priest told him, nonsense question, your father is Ammon, or Zeus Ammon, the Egyptian Greek god. And Alexander thereafter made a claim to divinity. Did he believe he was really the son of a god? Maybe, but it was certainly very useful politically for him to make that claim. After leaving Egypt, he went back up via Tyre again, where he held some games, and then went across the Middle East, eventually into what's now Iraq, where he met Darius III for the second of their two battles, which was at a place called Gaugamela, which is just south, I think it is, of Mosul in modern-day Iraq. Now, at Issus, as I mentioned, Darius had been forced to fight in a very confined area, so he couldn't make use of his entire army. At Gaugamela, he knew Alexander was coming, and he had plenty of time to get the battlefield just right for him, for his huge army. So he had this big wide space, and he levelled it so that he could use his chariots. Alexander met him. The chariots, scythed chariots no less, came thundering towards him. Alexander just told his men, when they come towards you, step aside, let them through. People with their sarissas, the long pikes that they used, will get the drivers at the back, which is exactly what happened. So the chariots were of very little value at all. The battle began. Alexander pulled. They're both facing each other. Alexander went to the right and pulled the Persian front line, or cavalry, to the right. This created a hole behind them in the middle where Darius was. So Macedonian kings fought on the right, Persian kings fought from the middle. So there was a hole, so Alexander wheeled round with his horse, and he and his cavalrymen, they attacked that hole as a wedge, like that Alexander at the tip. Ancient generals fought from the front, and they smashed into the Persian hole. I mean, it's a hole in the sense of the horses were gone, and now it was the soft underbelly Persian soldiers. He got that close to getting Darius. He was able to throw his spear at him. It missed, unfortunately. Darius eventually saw which way the battle was going, badly for him, and escaped. Darius pursued him, but then was warned that on his left wing, Parmenion, who was his most senior soldier, was under big pressure from the Persian cavalry. So he had to wheel round again to help Parmenion. Ironically, Parmenion, by the time Alexander got there, had got the situation under control. After Gaugamela, that's the effective end of the Persian Empire. Alexander took the three major cities of the empire. Babylon, famous Babylon, where he stayed for a month. His men enjoyed the high life that their newfound wealth and status gave them. Then he moved on to Susa, the city of Susa, and which accepted him, and then Persepolis, the big religious capital of, I think it is, of the Persian Empire. Now, Babylon and Susa were not damaged, but by the time that the Macedonians got to Persepolis, the men wanted to sack the city, basically, to get rich. That was what happened in antiquity. It's a surprise, to be honest, that this didn't happen more often in Alexander's expedition. Earlier on, there were cities that fell violently, but plenty others that didn't. Persepolis fell violently. The men got what they wanted. He remained in Persepolis for a few months, and from January through till May 330, I think. And then one night he had a party in Xerxes' old palace. Now, depending on the account you read, either Alexander put it to the torch to make a political statement against the Persians, or an Athenian woman named Thais, or Thais, I think is the proper pronunciation. Anyone who knows can tell me. She was from Athens, and she proposed that they destroy the palace in revenge for what Xerxes had done to Athens 140 years earlier. And Alexander, very drunk, said, yes, let's burn it, and burnt it down, regretted it the next day. As an aside, there's an amusing account of, well, non-account of what happened in Arrian, one of the major sources of Alexander's life. He glosses over it, possibly because he gets his story from Ptolemy, who became, the first pharaoh of the Ptolemaic line, and he also took Thais as his mistress later on, so possibly Ptolemy glossed over what happened for her sake, and Arrian took that on board, wittingly or otherwise, when he wrote his account. So after Persepolis, Alexander went further east, carried on east in pursuit of Darius. He eventually found him dead. Darius was killed by his own men, trying to get Alexander off their trail. Didn't work, not surprisingly, because one of the men, Bessus, proclaimed himself the next Persian king, so Alexander wasn't going to let that go. So off he went in pursuit of Bessus. He crossed the Hindu Kush into what is now Afghanistan, Bactria, Sogdia, Afghanistan, I think Uzbekistan, around there. He was there for a couple of years. It was a very well, much like now, the local population did not take kindly to being invaded, and they put